Yes, I will address categorization in papyrology by focusing on how modern scholars, rather than ancient writers, categorized texts. Modern scholars rarely tell us why they categorize texts the way they do, but we can tell by observing how they format their editions. They vote with their feet. It is the same with ancient scribes. They too rarely tell us why they categorize texts the way they do, but we can tell by observing how they format their texts. I will not pursue the latter here, mainly because it will not affect what scholars have been doing in the past 120 years or so, roughly since the publication of P-Oxy 1. You may have noticed that the title of my paper is modeled on Stanley Fish's "Is There a Text in This Class? The Authority of Interpretive Communities." I put editorial where Stanley Fish put interpretive, but it is the same thing. Editors of texts on papyrus are interpreters, and like every other interpretive community, papyrologists are, with a nod to Herbert Utey, artificers of texts. But are editors of texts on papyrus one community? I think a case can be made for multiple communities of papyrologists, who each focus on subsets of texts and approach their categorization, edition, and interpretation differently, like literary and documentary papyrologists, for instance. Papyri, in my definition, include ostraca, wooden tablets, and a few other movable writing materials that were not meant to be monumental or representational, unlike inscriptions. Now, epigraphers share some of the same worries as papyrologists, but they also have problems of their own, which may be non-existent in papyrology. While we do have a lot in common and should not confuse matters by adopting practices that are at odds with one another, we should also recognize the limits of any attempt at uniformity within the various disciplines dealing with ancient texts. The limits of uniformity also apply within these disciplines. Greek epigraphy is not the same as Latin epigraphy, and within papyrology, I suggest that there are multiple editorial communities. But note that for Greek and for Latin epigraphy, there have traditionally been two unifying instruments de travail, the SEG and l'année épigraphique. SEG is seemingly superior to the année épigraphique in that the latter messes things up by including some Greek inscriptions. Now, in Greek papyrology, we used to have the Zammelbuch as a kind of unifying instrument de travail for papyri from Egypt, but it too has messed up things by including inscriptions from Egypt and excluding literary papyri. The new unifying tool in Greek papyrology, no longer printed, papyri.info, now includes Greek literary papyri, but it also messes things up by including Coptic documents. This is because the traditional categorization of texts by language is breaking down for practical reasons, that is, digital technology, which simplifies and therefore encourages inclusivity, but also for ideological reasons which insist on inclusivity. The first factor, in my view, that affects categorization in papyrology is the where. For papyrologists, this means whether the papyrus is from Egypt or not. When papyri, etc., are not from Egypt but edited by a papyrologist, they are edited as papyri from Egypt are. But this is not always the case when such texts are edited by non-papyrologists. And before the late 19th century, there were no papyrologists. Thus, the early edition of Herculaneum papyri, of the Latin papyri from late antiquity, from Ravenna, and even of papyri from Egypt, were modeled on earlier editions of texts on other writing materials such as parchment or stone. The second and more important factor that affects categorization in papyrology is the language, whether the text is in Greek or not. Latin is not the same as Greek, and there's also demotic and hieratic, where notoriously two systems of transcription are possible, one into hieroglyphs, another into transliterationese, but the latter with a twist. There are multiple competing transliteration systems, which is of course a shame. There's also Arabic, Aramaic, and Coptic, and such papyrological texts are usually edited as pseudo-semi-diplomatic texts, but again with a twist. Arabic text editions usually print the text of the papyrus in the apparatus when it is wrong, where they also flag the diacritics actually on the papyrus. And Coptic text editions resolve abbreviations in the Greek portions, formulae in the texts. In recent decades, Demotic, Coptic, and Arabic papyrologies have become distinct disciplines, and two of them have their own congresses. The third factor that affects categorization in papyrology is the kind of text. The most important distinction, the one that we are discussing here, is between literary and documentary texts. We now tend to think, beyond the traditional division into documentary and literary, scholars have come to realize that their definition of what is literary and what is documentary should be dynamic. Any text can now be literary or documentary, but some texts are more literary or documentary than others. Further distinctions can be made. New literary texts can be pitted against known literary texts. Each of these categories comes with its own rules. New literary texts are edited twice, in diplomatic transcription and as edited texts. Known literary texts are edited only once, as edited, or, which is now more common, pseudo-diplomatic texts, but again with a twist, because the word division and even capitalization are introduced into such texts as well. Subliterary and documentary texts are edited only once. Documentary text can also be subdivided, in fact, into very many different categories, but the main is between public and private documents, and public documents tend to receive more elaborate commentaries than private documents. The fourth factor that affects categorization in papyrology is the when. By now, Byzantine documentary papyrologists have become a community, and they can choose their own rules if they want to. We, that is, the editors of Greek papyri from the Hellenistic and earlier Roman period, do not have to follow them. It makes a lot of difference whether a text is from an earlier or a later period. Greek documents from late antiquity come with lots of abbreviations and different formatting practices. Likewise, Demetists do not have to follow practices developed for hieratic text editions. Instead, they can choose to format their editions so that they are more accessible to Greek papyrologists. Early editors of Greek documentary texts, so from 1787 until 1840, modeled themselves on editions of inscriptions, where uniformity, at least for Greek inscriptions, was in the process of being established by August Buck, the man on the left. Subsequent editors of documentary and then also literary texts, starting in 1840 until 1898, continued this trend. In this period, uniformity for the editing of Latin inscriptions was in the process of being established by Theodor Mommsen, the man on the right. By 1898, the models for editing Greek and Latin inscriptions diverged widely, with the one for the editing of Greek texts turning more and more towards clarity and accessibility, and the one for editing Latin texts remaining incomprehensible and inaccessible. In 1898, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt started editing P-Oxy, and the system they devised established itself as a model early on. It was not generalized, however, until 1931, when their system was adopted at a session of the Congress of Orientalists meeting in Leiden, and has since become known as the Leiden system, now expanded for the electronic age to the Leiden Plus system. Earlier formats from before 1898 persisted for a while in Greek papyrology, but were eventually abandoned. Grenfell and Hunt also provided translations in their editions, and these have now become universal in papyrology. Less so in Greek epigraphy, hardly yet in Latin epigraphy. For Greek documentary texts from Egypt, the standards set up by Grenfell and Hunt still hold, more or less, even if for Greek literary texts from Egypt they have undergone significant changes. The reason why they were so successful is that they were articulate about their method of publication from the start. And the reason why they were so articulate is the same as the reason why they provided their editions with translations, their audience. This did not just consist of other scholars who do not like to be told what they are supposed to know already, but also of members of the general public who subscribed to the Egypt Exploration Society and expected something in return they could actually understand. The downside, the category of theological texts, which is one that no one else has adopted. What is now known as the Leiden system came about in the following way. By the early 1930s, the Belgian Academy sponsored a reconsideration of the way Greek and Latin texts, standard, medieval, papyrological and epigraphical, were edited. Bernhard van Groningen, from the University of Leiden, was asked to deal with the papyrological side, and together with Pierre Jouguet and Marcel Humbert, he staged a kind of coup at the Congress of Orientalists. He drew up what is now known as the Leiden system, basing himself on the editions of Grenfell and Hunt. But instead of limiting himself to papyrology, he presented the not-so-new system as applicable to the editing of all Greek and Latin texts, a grand projet d'unification. Van Groningen promptly published the Leiden system in Latin in Mnemosyne in 1932. He also published a longer version in French in Chronique d'Egypte of 1932 with different proposals. In that article, he switched the use of the double square brackets and the accolades. Now, Joseph Bidet and Andres Drachman included the version Van Groningen had published in Mnemosyne in Latin in their Conseils et Recommandations of 1932, revised in 1938, but they did not apply it to the editing of standard texts, where single square brackets continue to mark interpolations. The adoption of the not-so-new system was almost immediate in papyrology, and the system has been rather successful also in Greek epigraphy, not least because Ulrich Wilken was in charge of the Inscriptiones Graecae in 1931. Admittedly, Louis Robert felt left out, I can hear him, and held out the longest. Latin epigraphers did not get around to making sense of the 1932 Conseils et Recommandations until 1980. Now, before that, in 1968, the Association Internationale de Papyrologues issued its own Recommandations aux éditeurs de documents. Although the narrative provided on the AIP website suggests that these recommendations would be especially helpful in compiling indexes, the more important reason was the first electronic revolution in papyrology, the creation of a punch card database of Greek papyrus documents. The focus of the 1968 recommendations is squarely on numérotation in the service of numérisation. The second electronic revolution in papyrology in the 1980s has obliterated this early effort, but the 1968 recommendations are still sensible, if occasionally ignored, and also limited to numbering and such matters. On the next two slides, and we're not going to go over them in detail, I have collected what everyone should know about the Leiden system, just not the standard definitions, which can be found elsewhere. I have included only what these definitions do not tell you. And no one will ever tell you this in a consolidated account. We cannot go over these here. It's also more or less a work in progress. But I do want to address two conventions which are not part of the Leiden system, namely low dots for unread letters, dots below the line where the letters have not been read, and lunate sigmas. Both of these have made an impact on papyrology. Low dots among documentary papyrologists and lunate sigmas among literary papyrologists, and there are some overlap as well. Now, lunate sigmas are not needed for diplomatic transcripts, where non-final sigmas can be used throughout, as Grenfell and Hunt had done, and they are inappropriate, I think, in edited text, which are interpretations, that is, representations of the editor's decisions. We should be able to make decisions where words end. Now, low dots have virtually replaced the traditional spaced dots, and among Italian papyrologists, the low asterisks, in documentary papyrology, both inside and outside lacunae. But Grenfell and Hunt's use of spaced dots is, I think, superior in many respects. Spaced dots can be typed with every keyboard, and the presumed reason, I suppose, for the use of the low dots is non-existent, because spaced dots cannot possibly be mistaken for punctuation. The low asterisks of the Italians and now the pluses of the Latin epigraphers that they have been using since 1980 also seem to address non-existent problems. Now, I know papyrology, like politics, is a system that exists for the sake of reproducing itself, and systems will have to change in the process. We should expect to do things somewhat differently from our predecessors, but it has to be for a reason, and reasons need to be made explicit. The electronic revolutions have forced us to change some of the things we do, such as numérotation, even if there are still a few holdouts who insist on using Roman numerals. We now tend to edit more fragmentary texts, which require us to adapt the protocols developed by Grenfell and Hunt. We now also tend to edit more Byzantine texts, which have more abbreviations, and this requires changes in the apparatus, perhaps even in their number. Edgar Lobel, who incidentally pioneered lunate sigmas and low dots, also introduced separate paleographical and critical apparatus, because he had to deal with far more fragmentary literary texts than Grenfell and Hunt. It is, I think, time to adopt this sensible practice in documentary papyrology also, at least for Byzantine texts. As you can tell from this example from the Leiden papyri published in 1991, I was an early adopter of this system by separating the critical apparatus that you really need to read the text from the paleographical apparatus. The forthcoming corpus of Latin papyri is now implementing separate paleographical apparatus as well in Latin papyrology for literary and documentary texts. It is the only innovation for which Lobel provided a rationale in the preface of P. Oxy 18. He gave no reason for his erratic spelling of Oxyrhynchus with one H, which no one has adopted, nor for lunate sigmas and low dots. The fewer divergences from a standard set of characters, the better, I would say. Low dots are hard to print, as this on the screen and then on paper, as this example taken from a recent edition shows. Special characters that can be added, let's say, to IFO Grec, can sometimes also not be printed, even by the IFO itself. Again, this is a kind of a joke. Huh? It has nothing to do with the font, right? Sure. We may be able to avoid such glitches as technologies improve, but what we need is an authoritative list of symbols with their Unicode descriptors and codes, and a full explanation of their use. Things have changed over the years in P. Oxy, and at the front of every volume has appeared a note on the presentation of the texts, which has likewise changed over time. Curiously, the new one, first introduced in 1990, I hope that you can see it, and since repeated almost without change, refers to Van Groningen's article in Chronique d'Egypte of 1932. Apparently, successive editors of P. Oxy have yet to realize that we, in fact, do not follow his suggestions there, but rather those described by him in Mnemosyne in 1932. Now, since 1990, when this was introduced, the presentation of the literary texts that immediately follow this note in P. Oxy does not conform to it at all. Only the documents do, more or less, but there's not a word about lunate sigmas and low dots. For the literary text, we have to go back to the note that appears between 1941 and 1989, or rather notes. The note in 1941 warns, P. Oxy 18, warns the user that there have been innovations in the presentation of the new literary text edited by Lobel, and only those edited by him. They use lunate sigmas and low dots, and Lobel also distinguishes paleographical and critical apparatus and spells Oxyrhynchus with one H. How have Lobel's innovations fared over the years? After a few volumes of P-Oxy, all new literary texts are printed with lunate sigmas and low dots, and they all get separate paleographical apparatus. In 1962, more than 20 years after Lobel's innovations were first introduced, low dots are used for documents also. But lunate sigmas are introduced for documents only 4 years later in 1966. The 1966 format is the one now familiar from every volume of P-Oxy, except that the note was radically changed in 1990 to apply in reality only to the documents, and that incompletely. A lot of learned British papyrologists between 1941 and 1966, and then again in 1990, took decisions that affected the way texts are edited in P-Oxy, and now in many other editions as well. But to the best of my knowledge, not one of them has ever explained why, for instance, lunate sigmas and low dots are necessary. It is perhaps time to comment briefly, very briefly, on the choices made by ancient scribes, which I was not going to do, as I said early on. How they formatted their texts. How do we translate what we see they did into the edition of the ancient text itself so that it can be incorporated also into a database? There is much to be said for an edition where the ancient text itself includes as many pointers as to the layout and formatting, possibly also the script, as possible, and Jean-Luc has been leading the way here. That is why Grantham and Hunt resolved abbreviations in their text, but with parentheses around the letters left out by the ancient scribes. In the forthcoming corpus of Latin papyri, this practice has been abandoned. Abbreviations are not flagged as such in the text anymore, but only in the apparatus. This is common in medieval Latin text editions, but it is a disaster nevertheless. Okay, to sum up, papyrology is an evolving discipline, even if rather slowly, because papyrologists tend not to think, or at least not to think out loud. You may or may not like my findings, the lack of reflection on many of the changes that have been made since 1932, more particularly after 1941. And then I think language is the most important factor in the existing categorization in papyrology, and the distinction between literary and documentary is a good runner-up. The traditional barriers between the various papyrologies distinguished by language are breaking down, and it is or should be the same between literary and documentary papyrologists. I would welcome both of these developments. Thank you very much.